So I feel
Whoa.
like everyone in quarantine falls into quarantines, and I'm curious which one you guys are in, because there's like
Okay.
team sourdough starter, team garden boxes, and team full existential crisis. And I wonder where you feel like you fall in the teams.
I'm pretty clearly team garden boxes because I've been obsessing with my garden basically since this all started. I'm like, must grow edible food only,
Yeah.
in case of whatever. So
Supply chain interruption. That's where we went.
yeah, that's where I've been.
Can you hear
we're on
me?
team. Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear
And
us?
there's no tea kettle?
No
No
tea
tea kettle.
Okay, sweet. Then I will wear my
So
headphones.
Rebecca, I just asked Nora, I feel like everyone falls into quarantines. There's team sourdough starter, team garden boxes, and team full existential crisis. And I wondered which team you feel like you fall into.
Well, I'm definitely not in the first two. So I guess that leaves me in the third. Lucky me.
Nice.
Awesome. To everyone who's filtering in right now, we're going to get going in just a few minutes, but you're in the right place for the conversation with NK Jemisin and Rebecca Roanhorse, and we'll get started real soon. So is that an eclipse behind you, Nora, or?
Oh, it's a generic, I don't even know, sun rising over the curve of the earth thing? It's one of the basic Zoom backgrounds.
Nice.
I did actually have some backgrounds that I had the Studio Ghibli ones, and they turned out to be too busy. And like they made my hair look sort of strange and jagged because my hair kept blending into the Studio Ghibli background or something.
Yeah.
And I'm like, Studio Ghibli's trying to absorb me. There's nothing wrong with that. Then I tried the backgrounds from the Museum of Natural History, but then every time I did an event with another organization, they were like, well, we can't have you like doing the branding for this completely different organization in our background. Anyway, so I'm stuck with really boring backgrounds. I can't get anything as cool as Charlie Jane's dragon. What the hell? I just love that. Oh.
That's nice.
I like it because
where did you find that background? Huh?
I just did an image search for dragon and tried to find like a nice high-res piece of dragon art. I just stole it basically.
Nice.
I just completely stole it from the internet.
Nice.
If y'all are filtering in, you're in the right place for the conversation with Rebecca Roanhorse and Nora Jemisin. We'll get going in just a couple minutes. But in the meantime, you can message our event host, Charlie Jane Anders, with questions you'd like to ask the two authors at the end of the event, or towards the end of our time here. We'll do a moderated Q&A from the audience. So don't be shy.
I'm going to go away for a second. I just realized I've got Childish Gambino blasting in the background. Let me turn that off.
Or turn it up. Either one.
Well, we need to be able to hear those.
Party. No.
All right.
I just started watching Avatar: The Last Airbender for the first time.
Oh, me too.
Is it new for you too?
Yeah, I'm on season 2, about halfway through. I'm watching it with my 12-year-old, which is kind of, amazing. She's actually really into it, surprisingly. She is usually not that big of a sci-fi fantasy fan. But
it's so good.
It's really
I love
good.
the characters. I'm just finishing up the first season right now, so I'm a little bit behind you. But it feels like now I finally understand 3/4 of the jokes on the internet. Like, I just didn't get them before. Yeah. So that's very exciting. Yeah, all right. Well, I think we can probably get started. Firstly, thank you all so much for being here today. As of right now, we have raised just about $6,400 for Borderlands Books in San Francisco, which is fantastic. And thanks to our authors and thanks to you for making that happen. This is a We Love Bookstores event. I'm Maggie Takuta Hall. We put on a lot of these events, and we've got some great ones coming up, like with John Scalzi and Sarah Gailey in conversation. We haven't announced this yet, but we've got a pet pageant coming up. It's going to be amazing. Anyway, you can go to welovebookstores.org to see more about our events. But today we are here with Nora Jemisin and Rebecca Roanhorse. I'm going to read their bios real quickly, and then we're going to get into a Q&A with them. So N.K. Jemisin is the author of The City We Become. In 2018, she became the first author to win 3 Best Novel Hugos in a row for her Broken Earth trilogy. She also won the Nebula Award, 2 Locus Awards, and a number of other honors. Her short fiction has been published in pro markets such as Clarksworth, Tor.com, Wired, and Popular Science. Semi-pro markets such as Idiomancers and Abyss and Apex, and podcast markets. Sorry, it sounds like I've been drinking. I haven't, I promise. And print anthologies. Her first 8 books, novels, and novella, and 2 short story collections are out now from Orbit Books. Rebecca Roanhorse is a New York Times best-selling Nebula, Hugo, and Locus Award-winning speculative fiction writer and the recipient of the 2018 Astounding Campbell Award for Best New Writer. Her novel Trail of Lightning, book 1 in the 6th World series, won a Locus Award for Best First Novel and is a Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy finalist. It was also selected as an Amazon, B&N, Library Journal, and NPR Best Book of 2018, among others. Book 2 in the 6th World series, Storm of Locusts, has received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Booklist and has been named in Amazon Powell's and Audible Best of 19. Her novel, Resistance Reborn, is part of Star Wars. Thank you both so much for being here. To get us in the mood for lots of questions and answers, I thought we would do a little bit of rapid fire to warm up. So the rules with rapid fire are unflinchingly rigid, and they are these. Just shoot from the hip. You don't get to explain your answer. Just give the first one that comes to mind for you. Rebecca, I'm going to put you on the spot and start with you. Is Rebecca on mute? She is. Hold on 1 second. We're just unmuting Rebecca so that she can make rapid fire decisions that she has been put on the spot on for. Still on mute.
Okay, I am here.
Oh, there we go. Great.
Yay!
Okay,
Okay.
Rebecca, 5 rapid fire questions for you. Cats
All
or
right.
dogs?
Dogs.
Pizza or hamburgers?
Hamburgers.
Arsenic or grenades?
Oh, grenades.
Sunrise, sunset?
Sunsets.
Pirates or ninjas?
Oh, pirate ninjas.
Broke the rules, all allowed. Nora, are you ready for yours?
I don't know.
Emotionally?
Sure, let's go.
Okay. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Garden boxes or sourdough starter?
Garden boxes. That's
Inside or outside?
Inside.
Wizards or robots?
Robot wizards. I can't.
Breaking all the rules.
I can't decide.
Fire or water?
Water. Amazing.
Okay, those are our rapid fire questions. You guys made it out unscathed. Well done. That was the first task of many. So, since this is a We Love Bookstores event and all of our events support independent bookstores, 100% of the money all spent to be here today goes straight to Borderlands. I wanted to ask you what your relationships with indie bookstores has been like. Or like, what do you like about indies?
Anybody in particular or?
Anybody in particular, you know.
Rebecca, you want to go?
About bookstores.
No, you go first, Nora.
Oh, all right. Well, just sort of as a general thing, I was always one of those kids who got dropped off at the bookstore at the mall while mom went to Macy's or whatever. And of course, it was not independent bookstores back in those days. It was the Walden Books and things that don't exist anymore. But these days I get that feeling from indie stores. And, I love Borderlands. When I go to San Francisco, that is where I go. And here in New York, I patronize a couple of indie bookstores in Brooklyn in particular that are within biking distance are my favorite ones. And that's Word Books over in Greenpoint and Green Light Books, which is in my neighborhood, which is kind of Crown Heightsy, Fort Greene-ish, somewhere thereabouts. So I'm a big fan of all of these bookstores. People can get my stuff directly through them. I try and keep a supply of signed books with those stores so that people can get them if they want them. And in closing, patronize indie bookstores whenever you can.
I think my experience with bookstores is very similar to Nora's. That was where I went and hid while my mom shopped or my brother hung in the food court or whatever back in the day. And yeah, so now indie bookstores are really still my salvation, still a place I go to spend hours just wandering aisles and discovering new books I may have never found before. And so I really enjoy like sort of this curated experience that you get in indie bookstores from people who really love books. My closest indie bookstores are First Page Books in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Beasley Books, owned by George Martin, here in Santa Fe. And they have signed copies of most of my books. Absolutely.
And if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, Borderlands is now open for curbside pickup. So you can order either of these authors' books online and pick them up, which you should. So for both of you, your work is super different, but one thing that I think that you guys share that is so wonderful is like incredibly thorough and compelling world building. And I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about how you each approach that as a craft task. Do you start with research? Does it start with imagination? I'd love to hear from you about how you make your worlds feel just so real.
Nora, do you want to go?
Nora's on mute again.
Oh, okay. I'll go then. So I guess I actually most of my writing starts with character. So I will think of a character. For example, for Trail of Lightning, I was sort of like, what if there was this monster, hunter in a post-apocalypse Navajo nation? And, what would that be like? And then sort of I build the world out from there. I will say, though, for Black Sun, because it is an epic fantasy and because it's sort of big and sprawling and sort of a larger world than I've ever tried to write before, I did start a bit more with the world. I did a ton of research into sort of the pre-Columbian, pre-conquest indigenous Americas, the Maritime Maya, the empires of, the Aztec and cosmic cities of the ancestral Puebloans, all of that stuff. So I sort of created that world first. But I try not to spin out too much detail until I start writing, because I don't want to get lost in the minutia that some readers enjoy, but for me, the world building is really there to support the characters and the character story and the character's journey.
And Nora, you as well? She's still on mute, sorry. Rebecca, I'm very excited for your epic fantasy.
Sorry, filler. I keep trying to unmute myself, and it's like the host will not let you unmute yourself. Sit there and be quiet. Shit. What was the question again? I'm sorry, I forgot.
You guys both do such wonderful world building, and I wanted to know from a craft perspective how you approached building out your worlds, because you do very different worlds and also very thorough worlds.
Sure. I do like a 2-hour workshop on how I do world building. So, and it's difficult for me to kind of sum that up. For anybody that wants to see it, if you Google N.K. Jemisin and Wired, you'll probably see the last one that I did for the Wired 25 Festival last year, which is what I was in San Francisco for the last time I was there, actually. Anyway, but, to kind of sum that up, basically I kind of split world building into what I call macro world building and micro world building. And with the macro world building, I'm talking about like the externals of the world, the physicality of it. How many continents, what's the climate like? How do these things shape the people that developed on this world, yada, yada, yada. With the micro world building, I focus on the people. Because I've always kind of felt like, if you are trying to create a secondary world culture, or even a culture that's set in what looks like our world, the goal is to try and make a culture that feels real, that has actual resonance for people who are from our world reading your book. And so and I think it's kind of crucial for science fiction and fantasy writers to put as much effort into getting the people right as into getting the physicality of the world right, and the magic system and all that other shit. Oh, sorry. Is it okay for me to drop F-bombs and stuff in this? All right, anyway.
Fucking cuss all you want.
Thank you. Thank you. I can't help myself. Fuck. Anyway, sorry, they just fall out of my mouth. But anyway, so yeah, that's basically it. I don't put I put no more than about an hour or so of time into kind of constructing the original world, just because I don't want to, I put a lot more time than that into research, but I don't want to put it's not about the world building. It's still a story about people. And at the end of the day, I'm a character focused writer. So, I don't want to overdo it, but, just enough so that the world feels real. And then I build the rest as I go along.
Both of you have sort of mentioned that for you, the story is centered around character as opposed to world building, which is such a good reminder for all of us aspiring fantasy and science fiction writers. But I wonder, do you do the same kind of research for world building as you do for characters? Or do you find that you're stealing more from just people around you for your character work, or from other stories? Or how do you think about writing characters then? Building them from the ground up?
Rebecca, you want to take that one first?
Sure. Gosh. Yeah, I had to think about that. I guess for character, I write people. Gosh, I don't know. Maybe Nora, you should take that. Let me think about that.
Throw me under the bus in a heartbeat. All right. Okay, fine. Well, so yeah, I would say for me, they're very different kinds of research, because with the world, I'm usually researching science or history or something like that. And with the people, what I'm trying to focus on is making sure that I'm not doing anything harmful, or at least that I'm giving them the depiction that all human beings kind of deserve, that three-dimensionality, that realism, those layers of detail, understanding of power dynamics, stuff like that. So for with the city we became, I had to do a lot of physical research, because it's set in New York, but New York is huge and there's all kinds of layers to New York, and there were things that I had visited and forgotten, and I needed to visit again and see them again and make sure I got them right, because all of my friends live here and they'll kill me if I get it wrong. But then on top of that, because I had a lot of people who came from backgrounds that I don't share, like Bronca, who is the representative of the Bronx, is a Lenape woman, and I needed to, I had two different sensitivity readers who I consulted with on that. And one of them was a Lenape language specialist, thank goodness, who helped me kind of come up with her name, who helped me with the pronunciation when it was time for the audiobook. I didn't read the audiobook, but I had to pass that on to the reader, and things like that. So, trying to make sure I get the people right, especially in a real world setting where you're dealing with real people, is a whole other kind of research from trying to make sure you get the environment right. So.
Yeah, and I'll just 100% second what Nora said, because that sounded awesome and is absolutely correct. For example, there is a visually impaired character in Black Sun, and I worked with two visually impaired sensitivity readers to try to get that right. Even little minutia, how to understand adaptive technologies and try to avoid, superhero or superpower tropes, ESP tropes, things like that, when creating visually impaired characters. And certainly for all the Indigenous characters, I try to get multiple readers. Even though I am Indigenous, the experience is not monolithic. And so I'm often writing outside of my own individual experiences. So I try to get that right. And then overall, I think for characters, I'm going for a relationship. I'm going for emotion. I'm going to what I want the reader to feel, when they're reading, and for those people to be as real as possible. So what I'm always really digging into, what interests me, is relationships between people.
This kind of leads into my next question, which is specifically for Nora. In your new book, The City We Become, became, excuse me, which has been called a middle finger to Lovecraft by your fellow panelist here, which is my favorite pull quote I've seen for it. You wrote from so many different perspectives, and you touched on this a little bit, but how did you get into the mindset for so many different people? Sorry, Charlie Jane, she's on mute again. Unfortunately, the way that we use Zoomed in order to control the wonderful crowd that we have is that only the host can unmute people. So while it's typically good etiquette to mute yourself for just these events, it makes it a little tricky. Sorry, I should have warned you about that.
That's okay. No, I keep muting myself and then I'm like stuck in the mute box. So
yeah, it's like a hockey penalty box, but worse because we invited you to be here and then you can't talk.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm sorry. It was
about how you get into the mindset for so many different perspectives. You touched on it a little bit, but especially because your new book is real world adjacent. It's New York. How do you set about doing that?
Well, I mean, some of that is just like the way that my brain works. Like the characters appear in my head and they start yammering at me, and I try and like write down what they're saying as quickly as I can. And it's not, you know, I'm aware of the fact that that makes me sound weird, but I think a lot of writers have random people in their heads, and that is where some of this comes from. But then some of it is also, I need to try and get into their heads on purpose sometimes, and they aren't always talking to me. And that's just like, I'm trying to make sure that I make them interesting characters. I'm trying to make sure that they are interacting with each other in realistic ways, not always pleasant ways. And that's just writing. There's not really an easy way to sort of describe that. You need to understand the power dynamics between people as a sort of macro scale thing, but you also need to understand the individual ways in which those specific people are going to either defy those power dynamics or lean into them, and so on. And also you've got to take into account their personalities. That's just, there's no specific how-to with that. I just try to inhabit each of the characters during the period that I'm writing them. And if I have done it honestly and done it well, then the story almost writes itself.
That's wonderful. Rebecca, do you feel like your characters talk to you as well while you're inventing them?
No, I have a very sort of visual imagination. So often when I'm writing, my story is playing out almost like a movie in my head. And so I am watching my characters often, you know, listening to them, not necessarily interacting with me. I have a voyeuristic relationship with my characters often, but I'm certainly sort of watching them go through the story. And the story, just like Nora said, if you're doing it right and you're hitting all the right moments, then it sort of unfurls itself on its own, and you can sort of just go along and document it as it happens.
Changing gears a little bit, Rebecca, this question specifically for you. You're writing in the Star Wars universe now, which is so cool. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what it's like to have the reins on a universe that we all know and is like incredibly beloved.
Yeah, so terrifying. It's terrifying. Certainly when you get the gig, you know, when they first offered me the gig, I was like, absolutely, I will drop everything. I will write this Star Wars novel, whatever you want. Once I signed the contract, I was sort of like, oh shit, what have I done? You know? Yeah, but you know, Lucasfilm is very generous with both their sort of technical knowledge. They have a whole, you know, story group that helps you along if you need to know how to, you know, break a X-wing or something. They don't expect you to know how to do that. And then they're also very open to you creating your own Star Wars. You know, they want your voice, they want your experience of Star Wars. You don't have to try to copy anyone. Or, you know, try to make it sound a certain way. It's yours. And the coolest thing is I got to create Star Wars canon. So there are planets and characters and all sorts of stuff, you know, words that I got to put in Leia's mouth that are now canon. So that's pretty badass. I have to admit, that part's pretty cool.
Yeah, I imagine that would be very stressful because, I mean, when you put work out into the world, normally there's a sense of like, oh my gosh, now everybody can see my underpants. But when you're putting it out on such a grand scale and under a brand that is so familiar, I imagine that that pressure is exponentially weighing down upon you.
Right. Yes. And I had 4 months to write the novel, from like getting the gig to turning in the first draft.
4 months?
Yes.
That
they
makes
work
my
on
blood run
such
cold.
a tight
How did
schedule.
you do that?
You know, I had to seek therapy. No, it was tough. It was absolutely tough, but I learned a lot. It was definitely a learning experience about writing discipline and facing your fears, you know, and sort of pushing through. And of course, it has a rabid fan base, a very possessive fan base. So that can be challenging, especially as a Black and Native woman writing in this beloved universe. But yeah, I did it. So I guess that's what counts. And they had me write another short story, so I think they're okay with me.
Sorry, not to keep harping on you about this, but you said you wrote it in 4 months, which I'm still, my heart's like, I can't. And you said you learned some discipline. Do you mind sharing any of the tricks that you picked up in that 4 months while you were jamming out this novel?
Yes, you know, there's a craft novel called something like From 2 to 10,000 or 2,000 to 10,000, about how to increase your word count. And the gist of the novel basically is outline, outline, outline. Know where you're going, even the day of, outline your scenes in, you know, sort of detail, not just sort of generally. And so I would often write, you know, whatever I was going to write that day, like 3 or 4 scenes or something on paper before I sort of committed them to the manuscript, to typing them out. And you would be surprised how much that increases your word count every day. So that was probably the biggest difference. And I've taken that skill, or, you know, that technique, and kept with it. So that now I can write much faster than I did before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Whew. Still, I feel personally called out. That's okay. Not about me. Anyway, for both of you, I wondered, when you guys have both done such amazing work that has really carved space for other writers, and I feel like, or what I was really curious about is, when you think about your own work, do you think about it as being in the tradition of, in opposition to, or in conversation with sort of literary heritage or existing precedents?
You want me to do that one first?
You do that one, Nora. You could take
okay.
that one.
I would guess I'd have to go with in conversation with. I am in some cases explicitly responding to sort of classic science fiction and fantasy, the stuff I grew up on, and kind of pushing back against it and saying, this is what I wish I could have read instead. In some cases, I'm talking back to, especially with my short stories, I think, in a lot of cases, I'm talking back to kind of seminal short stories that exist already and that have helped to shape the field. Like I did a response to Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. I did a response to Heinlein's The Puppet Masters. That wasn't a short story, but you know, anyway, and things like that. And so in a lot of cases, yeah, I'm explicitly talking back at the genre and saying, yes, but, and here's my variation on it. And this is how all genres are. In some cases, I'm really, though, just kind of writing what I wish I could have had. Not specifically speaking to the genre, but speaking to its fans or its readers. I'm like, you know, I am a fan and reader still. The stories that I wanted to read weren't there when I was growing up, and even now. And I write what I want to read. If I at the end of the day have written a story that in a few years, once I've forgotten enough of it that it's no longer like super, I'm caught up in it. But in a few years, I can come back and read that story and feel like, wow, this is really good. Oh shit, I wrote it. You know, then I have done a good job. Because that's ultimately the goal here, is to get more good stuff stuff to read, and my memory is so crap that after a few years, I kind of emotionally and psychologically detach from the story enough that I can read it and feel like it's like a new reader to it. Like I don't forget it completely, but like I feel detached enough that I can enjoy it as an outsider, I guess. But it takes years for that to happen. So
yeah, I think I would agree with both of Nora's points. I think Trail of Lightning was definitely me writing back to the genre of urban fantasy in a lot of ways. Like I wanted to keep the tropes that I loved and use them as a framework to introduce people to a world that most people, this sort of the Navajo Nation and indigenous culture, most people are not familiar with. They only know it through very limited popular culture, often set in the 1800s where natives are dying and that sort of thing. So I wanted to set it in the future. And the things that would often work against natives, like the isolation of the reservation, suddenly became an asset. This allowed us to survive an apocalypse that the rest of the world could not. And then, of course, just in urban fantasy, you often have native characters, but they are not grounded in their culture or their language. They are interacting with vampires and werewolves and fae, which are awesome, but are also not indigenous. So I wanted my characters interacting with indigenous gods and heroes and monsters and things like that. So I don't know if that's reacting or in conversation with, probably a little bit of both. And the same with Black Sun, which is sort of this big sprawling epic fantasy. That is me setting an epic fantasy in a world, a secondary world inspired by indigenous America, the ancient indigenous America. Because I was tired of reading European-inspired epic fantasies, as great as they are and as much as I love a lot of them, there was no space for the story that I wanted to read, a story of like the people and the history and the things that I know on our own continent. So yeah, it's very much a reaction, I guess, to those sorts of things in the field.
My next question actually was if you could tell us a little bit about Black Sun. I'm dying to read it, and I'm sure everyone here would love to pre-order it from Borderlands Books. So if you could tell us a little bit about it, that would be wonderful.
Yes, everyone, please pre-order it from Borderlands. Yeah, so Black Sun, as I've mentioned quite a bit already, is my big sprawling epic fantasy inspired by the cultures of the indigenous Americas, which I mixed fairly liberally. It is still very much a work of fiction and a work of fantasy. There are spear maidens and warriors on the backs of giant corvids and blood magic and floating cities and things like that. So it's not a history, so don't get that twisted. But you know, again, it's also about people. It's about, you know, being saddled with a destiny that makes you a hero or a villain, depending on which choices you make. It's about trying to find home when you've been banished from your tight-knit community and they don't want you anymore. It's about a priestess trying to love an institution that does not love her back. So these are stories about humans, you know, about people in this world that are sort of in a time of turmoil and set on a sort of cosmic collision course with each other. Yeah, all in sort of this indigenous inspired Americas.
I think you had me at giant corvids.
Oh, yay!
Yeah, flying corvid or mounting corvids, blood magic and cosmic crash course. Like it's all a collision course is all. I'll take it. So, Nora, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about the city we became, but also tell us a little bit for aspiring writers here. This is now your third trilogy. What advice you would have for people who are who feel like their story demands to be a trilogy as well?
Well, okay. The reason I had that look on my face is because I still think of the Dreamblood as a trilogy that got kind of cut off. I originally, no, it's fine. I had originally intended for the Dreamblood to be a trilogy too. And I've talked in other places about the difficulty I had initially publishing that. It would have been my first novels. They did not get published first because there was less welcome in the industry at that time for novels that basically had all Black casts. And by the time it finally did get published, the story had kind of died in my head. So, so it's difficult for me to kind of give advice on how to not write trilogies because I've basically written nothing but trilogies in my own head. And now I think in trilogies. Now I think in terms of, okay, what are the 3 main character arcs? What's the overarching arc? This is how I like to tell stories now. Scratch that. This is kind of how I always liked to tell stories. To me, the thing that makes epic fantasy epic is its scale, sure, but also its kind of its adherence to the epics of old in some ways. Like when you look at the old epics from multiple civilizations, when you look at everything from like the Sundiata cycle to the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of that, you see stories that are told in iterations. You hear the smaller stories, and then there's always an overarching story that's ultimately being told. And so this is the thing. If you're trying to tell an epic story, you are effectively creating a new epic in my head. This is how I think of them. And so I don't really plan anymore to write just a simple short story. I did originally, when I first started out, write a different kind of trilogy. I wrote trilogies of 3 separate story arcs with 3 separate characters that all kind of fed into one overarching arc. With the Broken Earth trilogy, I decided to do a contiguous story where all 3 things were about the same person. And that was the first time that I ever did that. I enjoy doing that. There's no how-to to it. It's just a question of like the size of the story that you come up with in your head. There are smaller stories that are always interesting to focus on. There's no reason why you can't do standalones. It's just that in the publishing industry these days, like trilogies sell a little better. So that's what that kind of comes down to. I don't know if that answered the question.
I asked you 2 questions at once, which was maybe, no, that's my bad. The other question was just if you could tell us a little bit about the city we became,
right. I forgot about that.
which is the start of a new trilogy. Yeah.
Okay. So the city we became is based on a short story that I did a few years back called The City Born Great, which you can find online for free at tor.com. It was also in my short story collection, How Long Till Black Future Month. And so it's set in New York City in the modern day. It is a very familiar setting, although it's obviously a fantasy story because basically on page 1 of the book, the Williamsburg Bridge gets destroyed by a giant tentacle. Anyway, so in this story, the kind of mythos that I've created is that when cities reach a certain point of not size, but cultural complexity, impact, bunch of other things, when they kind of reach legendary status, they go through a kind of metaphysical change and they become living entities in and of their own rights. And so as part of this process, they choose an avatar. They choose a person who is their spokesperson, their focus, the source through which they channel their energy. And so a single human being becomes the representative of like millions of people, an entire city. And so New York goes through this process. It is born. Its entity is a young man who we see in the story, The City Born Great. And then in The City We Became, he falls into an enchanted slumber because fantasy, enchanted slumbers all over the place. And then the 5 boroughs, which in New York City are basically 5 cities in and of themselves. The 5 boroughs then awaken and have to kind of take over, and oh yeah, Cthulhu is involved. Yeah, no one expects the surprise Cthulhu. But there's an entity an extra-dimensional entity that for reasons has a problem with the existence of cities and is trying to kill New York at every possible turn. So that's what the story's about.
Very fun. For the last of our formal questions, and don't forget you can be submitting questions to Charlie Jane Anders now if you'd like to ask either of our authors questions. I just wanted to know what both of y'all are reading. What's good? What should I be reading? What should I buy from Borderlands?
I mean, I'm reading a lot of fanfic right now, so that doesn't help. Let's see. I actually am also reading stuff that isn't out, so that doesn't help either. Right now I'm reading P. Jelly Clark's Ring Shout, which I had been looking forward to greatly. I haven't read very far into it, so I can't really give you a good positive turnout on it, but I like his stuff in general, so I'm looking forward to that. That's it for buyable things. Maybe you can pre-order that one. I will recommend it, just on the strength of his other work. Oh, and I just finished reading Cassandra Caw's Nothing But Blackened Teeth, which also is not out yet, but is forthcoming as a novella. Maybe you can pre-order that one too. I love her work. She does delightfully brutal stuff, literally deliciously brutal, to reference her books about the chef to hell, which I very much love. So her writing's fantastic. You should check her out.
I just finished The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab, which is also not quite out yet, but you can pre-order it. And that is sort of about this girl and her relationship with the devil. She makes a deal with the devil throughout history to always be forgotten. And so that is sort of an amazing, sort of grand story. I won't say it's a love story. It's much more complicated than that, but it's really interesting. I am also reading just some brain candy novels. I read a great sort of dark romance about like bad boys at a prep school, which I just love.
Well, don't be coy. Tell us which bad boys at a prep school we're talking about here.
It was called Riot House, and it is definitely a little X-rated, so I just would put that out there. And then I actually read a P. Dielli. Is his name? How do you pronounce his name, Nora?
If he's using the pronunciation of the word jelly, it's like that, jelly.
Okay.
Mangling it, but yeah, Clark? Something like that.
Yeah, he has another novel coming out, and it might be after Ring Shout. And it returns.
Wait, Ring Shout has a sequel already?
No, it's unrelated.
Oh.
It's The Dead Gin in Cairo, right? So it's this wonderful sort of steampunk Cairo murder mystery. There was just a lot of fun. Yeah, so I got to read that one a little early, but he is amazing. He's one of my new favorites, I think. I try to read everything he does.
That sounds like a delight. All right, well, I'm going to start passing you all the questions from our audience. Thank you guys for submitting so many great questions. The first one is for both of you, which is if you all have any opinions about the terms high fantasy and low fantasy, and if the classifications like that are useful for authors.
No. I don't give a shit about stuff like that. I mean, that's a fan thing. Perfect. I think.
Sorry. I agree.
No, I love it.
Yeah. I try to avoid, honestly, I let marketing do the classification of my work. I just write what I want to write, and then they can figure out what it is.
Yeah.
I don't understand why fans are so obsessed with putting a divide there. And there's something to the existence of the divide that makes me a little squinchy, and I'm not sure I can articulate what it is. It feels to me like a way of applying some power dynamics to the imagination. And I find it a little off-putting, and I cannot quite put my finger on what the problem is. Some of it has to do with the fact that I have never seen anything but European flavored stuff labeled as high fantasy, and that we are hierarchical people who think of high as better than low. So there's some of that that's making me squinch a little at it, but also I just don't see the point of the distinction. It feels like unnecessary pedantry to me.
Perfect.
Okay.
Rebecca, Allison Buckman asks, she taught Trail of Lightning in a fantasy class this semester. My students loved your book. What would you want to make most clear to the students encountering Indigenous myths for the first time?
I guess that they are living, breathing sort of entities. Indigenous culture in and of itself, it's not static, it's dynamic, it's always changing. You know, one of the things that I've tried to do to varying results and reception is bring Indigenous culture into popular culture. To sort of make it something fun and interesting, almost like a superhero sort of engagement level. And young people tend to respond to that super positively. Older people maybe not so much, but for valid reasons. There's a history, of course, of Native cultures not faring so well when introduced to the mainstream. But definitely just that living, you know, Natives are here. They will exist. They exist in the future. They are living, breathing cultures and entities and people that exist.
Yeah. I feel like this leads nicely into a question that I feel like a couple people were asking differently, which is basically, how do you all work with sensitivity readers? Why do you work with sensitivity readers? And how did you find them?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. Sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say sensitivity readers are somebody you pay to read your book to sort of find things where you might have been accidentally problematic, mistakes that you made with representations that play into tropes that are harmful to the people that you're trying to depict. Anyway, just in case anyone had not heard of them.
Yeah. As for why you work with sensitivity readers, you know, because not all of us can inhabit all identities, and however compassionate we think of ourselves as being, not compassionate, that's not the word, empathetic. However empathetic we think of ourselves as being, however any writer is supposed to be able to inhabit the mindset of very different groups of people, there's still things that we're not going to have that lived experience of doing. And to a large degree, it's kind of, it's not going to, there's no way that you can, without living that experience, there's no way that you can inhabit that space as thoroughly as you kind of want to. And so, you know, the best that you can do is research as much as you possibly can so that you can try and get close, write what you need to write, and then run that past somebody who has actually lived that experience, and understand the fact that that one person can't represent millions of people. You know, there may be stuff that they miss, that's on you. There may be things that you just not only got wrong, but did so badly that it actually causes harm to those people. That is the main purpose of a sensitivity reader, is to try and help you not do things that are going to hurt that community. Because in our society, we're all experienced in how to tell the perspectives of cishet white dudes. That's all we've read. In a lot of cases, we had to practice or work hard not to write that identity, because when you've read so many stories from that perspective, you can write that perspective because that's really all you can write. And so, but if you're writing anything other than cishet white dudes, even if you're writing other people who inhabit your own identity, I'm a Black woman, and it took me a long time. It took me a lot of fucking practice to get Black women right. So you need a sensitivity reader to help you try and make sure that you're not doing harm to those identities as well. Because when you're writing anything other than a group of cishet white dudes, there is a chance that what you're writing could could impact the way that society views those people in a negative way, could add to stereotypes that already exist about that group of people, and so on. So that's basically it. As for how I worked with sensitivity readers, I asked around. I asked my publisher for some assistance in trying to find some people. Like for Padmini, who is a Southeast Asian character who represents who represents Queens. She's an immigrant. She's not even first generation. She herself was born in Chennai. She's also, I needed to understand like the power dynamics of the fact that she is Dalit, which I had read about, but I am not Dalit. Dalit is in the supposed caste system that no longer exists, that actually does still exist because caste societies can't shake that stuff off too easily. Dalit were known, what a lot of people know as the untouchable caste, or the unscheduled caste. There's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of baggage associated with it. And there's a lot of potential room for harm to be done. And so I spoke with readers who could help me specifically with that. And so that's the kind of thing that I basically wanted the readers for. And it was really useful stuff. Like I said, with the reader that I have that did the Munsi language assistance, he gave me character names, he gave me specific phrases to use, and it was super useful stuff. So, and of course I paid him for that expertise. It's a business expense, it's tax deductible, and it's necessary. These are experts, you want them paid for the work that they're doing.
I would just agree again with everything Nora says. I think sometimes people get stuck on the term sensitivity reader. I like to think of them sort of like cultural editors or something. The same way you would work with an editor, I want someone who knows better than me about this experience to take a look at it. And if, you know, everything that people say, just like with your editor, you could take it or leave it. But certainly you need to hear it. And so, for example, I know I lived on the Navajo Nation for a couple of years. My big extended family through my husband is Navajo, but I am not fluent in the language. And so I had Navajo sensitivity readers outside of my family read Trail of Lightning, and they helped me a lot, especially with the language, and Race to the Sun, which is my kids' book that's very similar. And with, you know, some of the details, they can also say, oh, you know, this is a really interesting point you make. You can follow it to here, you know, because this is Navajo thinking, or this is the way that you would maybe approach this. And I could be like, oh, that's awesome. That adds to the story. So rather than think of, I think, cultural editors or sensitivity readers as someone who's trying to constrain you, they're really there to help you do your best work, to be your best, sort of, and write the best story. And like Nora said, you absolutely pay them and thank them for their work, and you never throw them under the bus if you mess it up anyway.
Yeah, that seems like it should go without saying. So Gayatri has asked for both of you, do you have a book list or research list for what you looked at while you were writing your newest novels, Black Sun and The City We Became?
Well, I mean, I have some books that I did, but I was deliberately trying not to write history. It's fantasy. At the end of the day, it's not a textbook. So most of my research was about realism and verisimilitude. Sorry to throw the 900 syllable word at you guys, but I live in New York. I had not visited Staten Island in years. I needed to make sure that I got the feeling of Staten Island right. For those of you that have read the book in particular, you probably understand why it was super important for me to make sure I was not just kind of going on my typical Brooklynites negative opinion of Staten Island. Because like all New Yorkers talk shit about other boroughs. That's just the nature of that you know, it's friendly competition between boroughs. It's also general hatred. So, you know, I've lived in Brooklyn on and off most of my life. I have a typical Brooklyn person's negative opinion of all the other boroughs. And I tried not to let like that stereotyping be the core of what I did. So I went to Staten Island. I walked around on the beaches. I walked around in the grocery stores. I had random conversations with people. I had a deep sit down with the art director of Orbit, actually. Lauren Panapinto, who grew up on Staten Island. I had a long sit down with other people that I knew who had grown up on Staten Island, and they talked to me about the attitudes and like how much truth there is to the idea that Staten Island is, you know, like the red state of New York, and and so, you know, that was the kind of research that I did. It wasn't that's not the kind of thing you can get from books. I did research a bunch of New York facts, but you can't get like, what does the Staten Island ferry smell like on a day when the tide is low and the bogs are funky? You know, you can't get like, when you go to Fresh Kills, does it look like it used to be and yes, it's called Fresh Kills. Does it look like it used to be a giant landfill? No, it's a beautiful park now. So these are all things that you have to make sure you get right when you're writing about a contemporary setting and contemporary people. So research with books and a list of books. I can give you the books that I use, but they aren't going to help a whole lot in terms of what I really wanted for the story. So yeah, it's not a history book.
Yeah, that was a wonderful. So. Yeah. Rebecca?
There's actually a list of books that I recommend in the back of Black Sun and the acknowledgements, because it is very much drawn from sort of ancient history. And there's a awesome book called, I actually have it in front of me because my computer's standing on it, called Gifts of the Crow, which is this wonderful book about how we understand crows and crow society and crow thinking and crow culture, of literal crows, written by sort of a scientist and an artist together, which I drew from a lot because I learned so much about corvids, and it's all awesome.
So smart.
Because I created like a corvid mythology in this book. So yeah, so you can definitely check that out. It's in the back of the book, and I drew from like Aztec poetry and Mesoamerican texts, the ones that survived the Spanish or that the Spanish, some of them saved. But anyway, so because it is drawn so much more from history than something more contemporary like what Nora's talking about, or even Trail of Lightning, which is really just a lot of lived experience, there are books to be read.
For both of you, we have a question from Chinello. I'd like to ask how they both deal with ingrained anti-Blackness when they write. How do you create worlds without racism or anti-Black sentiments when it's part of the swamp of global white supremacy that we've all had to swim in?
That's a toughie for 3 minutes left. Or how long do we have left on this one? It's not the kind of question you can easily answer. It's just personally having kind of studied how oppression works, how American history works, particularly when I'm writing a story that is set in America right now. A lot of that is just coming from lived experience. A lot of that is coming from my own understanding of how ingrained it is, as Chinello is pointing out. There's not a specific technique that I can suggest. You just need to be aware of how the world actually works and how our society works. You've got to keep that in mind at all times while you're writing.
Yeah, and I agree. I think for an author, you have to constantly be questioning your own biases and your own prejudices, because it is so deeply ingrained. Like Nora said, you know how to write that cishet white dude because you've been reading his experiences your entire life, especially in science fiction and fantasy. And you know, those are the characters I first wrote. I wrote a bunch of like farm boys on quests, you know, that sort of thing.
Same, yeah.
And you have to, you know, constantly be working at the deprogramming to write any other kind of characters, especially Black characters. But yeah, it's an ongoing process. You don't reach at least for me, I don't reach a final point and be like, aha, I got it. I can write everybody now. You know, I've got to constantly be working at it and interrogating myself.
Thank you both so much for being here today. As we mentioned, we raised about $6,400 for Borderlands, but they're an institution in San Francisco who do an amazing job making sure all of us can find exciting science fiction and fantasy books that may not have been on our radar before. And it's such an essential part of the literary community. And so we're so happy that we were able to help, and we're so grateful, Nora and Rebecca, for your time. Thank y'all so much. As mentioned at the beginning, at the beginning of the event, I mentioned you can find more of our events at welovebookstores.org. If this event was your jam, you'd probably like the John Scalzi and Sarah Gailey event we've got coming up to support Dark Carnival Books, which is another science fiction fantasy bookstore in Berkeley that's awesome and weird and great and have books stacked up to the ceilings. Or that kind of store. So we hope to see you there. We hope to see you at our pet pageant. We hope to see you just everywhere in at bookstores. There is no graceful way to end a Zoom event. So thank you guys so much for being here.
Thank you.
We have come to the end of our formal programming. It's time just to wave and ask as
just
you
lost
see
somebody.
fit.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys too. It's great seeing you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Guys.
This is so fantastic.
Bye. Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Unmuted,
I'm seeing everybody now. All right, I'm out. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.
A lot of people are unmuted.
That's the sound of 270 people leaving the Zoom room.